For more on the latest developments, let's speak with Alexey Muraviev, who joins us from Perth, Australia. He's an Associate Professor of National Security and Strategic Studies at Curtin University. Really good to have you back with us, Alexey. Let's start with this apparent assassination. What does this say about security at the heart of the Russian state, given the fact that this attack happened in central Moscow and to a senior general, no less?
Well, clearly, it's yet another failure on the part of the Russian counterintelligence, given the fact it's not the first assassination attempt, and there have been calls in Russia to provide enhanced security detail to top military commanders. Given the position that Major General Sarvarov occupied, which was head of the Department of Operational Training within Russian General Staff, so he was certainly at the core of Russia's war planning as well as other contingency planning. It's a significant failure as well as an image blow to the Russian authorities, because whilst the Russians are making ground on the battlefield, the Ukrainian security services, if they are behind it, because the Russians haven't formally confirmed yet that that's the only reason for assassination, obviously gaining advantage by striking Russia from its rear.
Yes, because we've heard several times from the likes of the US President Donald Trump that in this ongoing war, Russia has the upper hand, and that might be the case on the battlefield. But this attack does expose vulnerabilities elsewhere in the Russian state, doesn't it?
Well, it does. And I mean, the Russians have been subjected to a campaign of sabotage, of acts of terrorism as part of Ukraine's asymmetric response. We should remember a drone air assault on Russian strategic bomber bases, which turned out to be quite successful and innovative. And certainly we should also be mindful that these attacks normally occur at the time when either the Russians demonstrate even greater advantage on the battlefield, and there is an attempt to not just decapitate Russia's operational command, but also create a sense of disjointments by taking out one of the key figures. But at the same time, clearly there is an attempt to compromise the ongoing political dialogue aimed at the political solution of the crisis, because Putin and the Kremlin will now be in a very difficult position. Either they will be compelled to respond in kind, which would provide Ukraine with additional political ammunition. If they would withheld any response, well, that would create anger and disappointment within the Russian society, because it's been part of this systematic sabotage and terror campaign for quite some time, and the Russians obviously want to see reprisals. They want to see counteraction. However, it can also be used by the Kremlin as a way to simply say, well, you know, we demonstrate goodwill to negotiate, but every time progress has been made, the Ukrainian side comes up with a narrative that makes us impossible to continue the political dialogue. So all of these cards are on the table right now.
Let's talk about that political dialogue, because after 3 days of talks in Miami, the US envoy Steve Witkoff says talks that he held with Russian and Ukrainian delegations separately were productive. Is that your view as well? And what was he hoping to achieve by holding these talks?
Well, it's a continuation of the communication channels that the Russians and Americans established after Trump came to the office. And there was obviously an agreement behind closed doors that the two sides would be working on one hand, restoring strategic relations between the nuclear superpower and on the other superpowers, and on the other hand, removing the obstacle in rebuilding those strategic ties, which is obviously the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, which Russia views as a proxy war between Moscow, Washington, and Brussels. It's really interesting, because when it comes to any conversation or any reporting on Russia-US dialogue, it creates an information vacuum, and that's been certainly purposefully done, and the Russians insist on that because they don't want to have any disclosures to media about the nature of the conversation, preliminary outcomes, and so on and so forth, which is a striking difference to when the Ukrainians held similar talks with U.S. counterparts, or the Europeans hold similar talks with U.S. counterparts, or there are conversations between the Europeans and the Ukrainians. So we can only guess by what has happened and what does this sort of positive messaging is supposed to say. Putin's envoy Dmitriev was, as the Kremlin described, on the gathering mission. So he was there to listen, to absorb, and take points from the U.S. counterparts with regards to what they managed to negotiate with the Ukrainians, with the Europeans, and bring back those terms and new proposals to his boss, Vladimir Putin. And obviously then it would require a follow-on conversation. So whilst that Miami segment may have proved to be successful, it very much depends on how Putin would respond to whatever Dmitriev would report back to him upon his return to Moscow after concluding his conversations with Witkov as well as Kushner.
Okay, Alexey Muraviev, always really good to get your thoughts. Thanks again for joining us.